Welcome to Peppel and Wagner's webinar, Learning Models, What House Bill 164 Changes and Doesn't for the 2020-2021 school year. My name is Samantha Vaskop. I'm an attorney at Peppel and Wagner. I've been one of the attorneys focusing in the last several weeks on the legislative developments within the state of Ohio, trying to plan and provide guidance to school districts for the next school year now that we're sort of past the spring rush for the pandemic and going into the future.
And my name is Brian DeSantis. I've also been working on this with Sam. And, I think Sam and I could both talk about the number of conversations that we've had with superintendents or treasurers or board members that, questions about for the 2021 school year, can our district instruct students using blank? And again, thinking about all the different tools they have, but then also expressing concerns about using those tools to make sure that they're meeting the requirements under the revised code, whether it relates to the minimum number of hours school is to be open, or trying to decipher the meaning of different types of models, whether it's blended learning or as we'll learn briefly or shortly here about with remote learning. So again, I think we've been answering a lot of those questions, and 164 has given us some guidance as to what districts can be doing in the fall and whether or not state approval is needed or what documentation you have to submit, as well as what kind of deadlines you have.
And we thought that the webinar format was a good opportunity to just have this conversation and be a little more candid about the types of instruction that you can use in the fall rather than a longer written blog post trying to kind of compare and contrast all these different things. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to just have that conversation instead of trying to read a bunch of guidance, or in our case, read House Bill 164 very, very carefully. So when you're doing your planning, I'm sure at this point everybody's heard probably every term possible for the existing methods or some of the existing methods to deliver instruction to students. So during the pandemic, we heard all kinds of terminology, which are now available on your screen. The first bullet point, in person and brick and mortar, refers to sort of your stereotypical school setting where you picture a student in a seat in a classroom with a teacher giving that instruction face to face. That's sort of what we think of stereotypically when we think of school and learning in the state of Ohio. But obviously, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the school building closure, a lot of adjustments had to be made. And what we started to hear were all manner of terms to describe different ways that school districts were handling being able to provide instructions to students even though their buildings were closed. Some of those things have specific meanings, some don't. And it's really important to understand and be precise about what it is that you're doing.
Right, and the terms, again, sometimes we've heard these terms be used generally during whether it's a press conference with the governor, where a term like blended learning is used, and there's this understanding that maybe we're all going to blended learning in the fall. But when we hear some of these terms like blended learning, that actually is defined and is a term of art in the revised code. And so we want to make sure that we're being accurate with what we're saying and understanding the duties and the obligations that come along with doing something like blended learning. So again, although distance learning, virtual learning, enrichment opportunities, maybe those terms may describe what you're doing. Other terms like blended learning, remote learning, blizzard bags actually have specific meanings in the revised code. And again, we're gonna focus more on that today to help you work through how your classroom or your schools will be looking in the fall.
Right. So we did hear a lot of these things in passing. I think, Brian, you and I have talked about the initial use of the term extended spring break when school buildings were closed. I know we moved pretty quickly away from that, but today we're going to highlight some of the major differences between what it looks like most school districts are exploring for next school year. And those are blended learning, the use of blizzard bags, and then House Bill 164's implementation of remote learning. So with that, I'll get started with a concept I think we're all very familiar with, blizzard bags. So blizzard bags have existed for a number of years, and typically they've been used for your sort of classic school building closure. Not always anticipated, but something that you have in place because on the off chance you have to close for any of the reasons that are listed in the statute, you have a plan that requires students to access classroom lessons either through the actual paper packet, the stereotypical blizzard bag that you're thinking of, or through some method of online delivery or online posting of those lessons. The limitation with Blizzard bags, there are a couple of them. First, you have to have that plan in place no later than July 31st of a given year. And second, you can only use a Blizzard bag to make up to the equivalent of 3 school days. So in any given year, this is sort of a contingency plan in case the school district needs to close for a couple days so that you can still, as a district, meet the minimum hours of instruction that are required under Ohio law. The interesting thing that happened in the spring was when the Ohio legislature passed their emergency legislation for the pandemic, House Bill 197. What they did was sort of made Blizzard bags a lot more powerful than they used to be previously. What House Bill 197 said was if you haven't adopted a Blizzard bag plan yet, you can do so now, even though we're after the deadline. If you've already adopted a plan, you can amend that plan. And what you can do under your Blizzard bag plan is provide for making up any number of hours. So you see on the screen that we've got for 2019, 2020 only, it allowed schools to make up blank number of days. And what the legislation actually said was any number of hours that schools were closed in that school year in compliance with the COVID-19 orders. So this was the sort of fallback provision that ensured schools were meeting their minimum hours requirements and that gave them the flexibility to provide some method of online delivery or paper packets or whatever the case may have been to deal with school building closures. So some
Yeah,
districts did that. I know some may or may not be aware that this extension was given.
yeah, and so this was again the first, I would say, alternative option that was introduced and passed as legislation to deal with alternative forms of education during the pandemic. So again, this is one way that the General Assembly said that we can codify to make sure that those hours are being met. If you're doing that through Blizzard bags or I guess virtually, and it gave you the option. But the premise has always been that schools themselves have been closed. So again, we met that requirement when districts and schools were unable to have students attending in person, but then there was still an expectation that those students were learning. But 197 did not extend that requirement past the 1920 school year. And as of the date of this webinar, there has been no such extension in any other legislation. So 1920 is the only year for which you'll have unlimited days to be making up via Blizzard bag or virtually for when the school has been closed.
Now, even though this might not be a long-term solution for your district going into the fall, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a Blizzard bag plan in place because the Blizzard bag statute permits the use of making up those hours for any number of reasons. It's not just limited to, a health crisis. It can also be hazardous weather conditions, all the things that traditionally had closed schools. But you want to have something like this in place probably just as a contingency plan, if nothing else. So it's an option for you for the fall, but not a long-term solution that's going to cover you to make sure that you meet instructional hours if for some reason you're not able to fully open to students in the traditional sense that you have been.
And then we'll talk about this at the end, but there still is the deadline where if your board is going to have Blizzard bags in place or Blizzard bag plan in place, there will need to be board action. So again, this is one of the things your board should be looking to do in the month of July.
So Blizzard bags, good solution for some things, not so great for long-term planning. But one thing that I know a lot of school districts started to look into for the fall was blended learning instead. And Brian, I know this is a statutory term of art, right?
Correct. And we can all remember back to the one of the press conferences where Governor DeWine was saying, in the fall, we can expect schools to be using blended learning. And all of a sudden, blended learning popped up in a number of news articles and the suggestion that you may have some of your students attending school 2 days a week while the other, 3 days a week, students be working from home and there'd be this rotation of schedules. So this is one of the plans that was being put forth under the concept of blended learning. However, under Ohio law, blended learning is a very specific term. And the definition is on your screen, and it's the delivery of instruction in a combination of time in a supervised physical location away from home and online delivery whereby the student has some element of control over time, place, path, or pace of learning. And that's a lot. It's a pretty dense definition, but if you can break it down to three specific parts. So the first part is a supervised physical location away from home. That may be a very fancy way of saying school. However, the way it's defined, it could be someplace other than a school building. But again, I would say for most school districts, school will be the primary supervised physical location away from home. And then the second component is that there is online delivery. And this is the part that may be surprising. And again, when we hear a lot of times others speaking about blended learning generally, maybe we leave this part out, but there is an online delivery component. So there is some electronic aspect of what you're learning. So the expectation is when you're not at the school building, that there will be some online delivery. And then the last component is that the student has some element of control over time, pace, or time, place, path, or pace of learning. So one of those also has to be present. And only when you have those things are you doing blended learning under the revised code. If you do go down this route, there is no specific time ratio of time at school or online delivery. But if it feels like this may not fit perfectly into what we're describing maybe in the fall, or that if you're thinking about maybe a situation when your school might have to be closed entirely, if there's an outbreak in your community, that's because the definition of blended learning well precedes the pandemic. The term was actually defined in 2012. And so it really hasn't been made with the pandemic in mind.
At least not
and the reason
specifically.
I bring that up is that a number of school districts have been going down the route of preparing a plan for blended learning, because under the revised code and pursuant to rules that have been adopted by the Board of Education, you have to adopt a policy that has a number of different components that are part of the plan. And they're very specific. We'll, at the end of the presentation, we'll actually compare those to a remote plan, and you'll see the differences. But again, the focus on a number of the components is that there is that online delivery and making sure that students have access to digital learning tools necessary to access the online or the digital content. And Sam, I think as you and I have talked about, that can be a problem for a lot of school districts.
So in evaluating whether this is a legitimate option or a realistic option for your district in the fall, keeping the specific statutory requirements in mind and talking with your board council about how to implement those things is going to be really important in order for it to qualify to be a true blended learning plan under Ohio law. And it's not with the Blizzard bag statute that we just talked about. All a Board of Education has to do is adopt a plan that says, here's what we're going to do in the event that we have to close due to the reasons under the Blizzard bag statute. For blended learning, you alluded to the fact that there have to be policies in place as well, not just a board adopted plan, right?
That's right. So the policies have to be adopted and the procedures have to be adopted. And under the revised code, the statute specifies that the policy has to be in place, and you have to notify the department that you'll be using such a program by July 1st of each year. That deadline, it's our understanding, has been extended by the state superintendent and Department of Education, which now specify that the deadline for notifying the department is now November 1. So that authority was granted pursuant to House Bill 197, again, the first COVID-19 legislation that really impacted school districts, that allowed the state to extend deadlines. So this deadline's been extended, but as we'll talk about shortly, waiting to that November 1st deadline might be problematic for your district.
And you mentioned that there are specific requirements and things that need to be included in that you have to consider with blended learning. One of them, as I understand it, is this idea of competency-based learning.
Right. So the concept of competency-based learning means that students can earn credits by demonstrating mastery of knowledge or skills. And this comes straight from the administrative code, but it also provides that credit shall not be based on a minimum number of days or hours in a classroom or on a digital learning device. So the administrative code envisions really a system where students have more flexibility to move through the curriculum. And other parts of the plan also that may seem little bit unusual that I think you need to talk to council about is the concept of a teacher of record. Again, this is something that we often hear of in EMIS, but also is a very specific definition. So making sure that you have the proper teacher of record and what that may mean. And then also thinking about the other requirements to make sure you can actually implement a blended learning program in the fall. So while I think we're going down this route to adopt blended learning policies and having those in place for the fall, this may have also been the preferred option until we heard of House Bill 164.
Right. And that's a good way to transition, because if you are one of those districts that sort of started to pursue blended learning for next school year, you're probably going to want to reach out to your board council to talk about how that House Bill 164 impacts your ability to use either instead or in combination with blended learning, the concept of remote learning. So let's just talk about it. Remote learning is this quote unquote new concept introduced by House Bill 164. And unfortunately, it's not defined anywhere in that statute. So as far as what it is, we don't entirely know yet.
And in some ways, that might be the great part about remote learning, is that a lot of the concept of remote learning is not defined, but it essentially, House Bill 164 gives school districts the ability to define what remote learning is.
And I want anybody who's listening to this who has been paying attention to all the updates in the spring, you may remember that the Ohio Department of Education provided a resource guide in the spring that was called Remote Learning Resource Guide. That was back in April. There's nothing to indicate that that's the same thing as what is being called remote learning in House Bill 164. So be cautious there. Don't assume that you know what it is. Brian, you said it's great because without a definition in the statute, there's some flexibility. For attorneys with my type of personality, that lack of definition makes me a little bit nervous, but that's why board council exists.
And I guess I would say this too, with remote learning, basically what it suggests is that, there's a recognition that local control is important, that school districts need to have different options. Again, we were talking before about blended learning, that how it could be problematic for your district depending on your access to whether it might be Chromebooks or bandwidth issues, or even maybe having some of your younger students doing learning online might be an issue. Remote learning gives a little bit more flexibility into adopting a plan that you would not have with blended learning if you are seeing those as two different options. And again, we're not saying that it's an either or, but until 164 came, remote learning and the concept was not something that was really identified in the in statute.
Right. But the tricky thing for those districts that started to pursue blended learning is what House Bill 164 does is it defines what schools are eligible to adopt a remote learning plan. And what the statute defines as a qualifying public school is a school district, community school, or STEM school that has not been approved to use a blended learning model for the 2021 school year as of the effective date of House Bill 164. So it's a little bit tricky. If you've already started the process, but now you might be interested in remote learning, this is why you're going to have to take a closer look at it and make sure that you're able to pursue both of those things based on what the Senate has done. And I think this goes to a little bit what happens when we try to enact and quickly legislate an issue kind of on a rush time period.
Right. And, one of the problems is that depending on how long, if you're an administrator, you've been at your district, you may not know that your district has already adopted a blended learning policy or has those in place. And we've prepared policies for some of our policy clients. But if you don't know that your district's already adopted one, the declaration form that you have to submit to the Department of Education does not require you to submit that form annually. So once it's in place, it's in place. And perhaps another quirk of 164, it says something about the department approving you to use blended learning. And really the department doesn't approve anyone. You just declare that you are using blended learning. So again, some questions with the legislation, but Sam, as you said, that's what happens when something like this with 164, again, this language, the concept of remote learning was introduced right before it was adopted, when all the language related to the pandemic was added to 164, which existed as a very different type of education bill previously.
Right. And the remote learning, it does have specific requirements that we'll get into in a moment, but the important thing to know about the ability to adopt a remote learning plan under House Bill 164 is its impact on the minimum hours requirement. So if a school district adopts a plan that complies with House Bill 164's requirements, then for the 2020-2021 school year, that school district is considered to have complied with the minimum hours requirement, which is great. It actually says that specifically in the statute. And because minimum hours are tied to funding, that raises, I know a lot of treasurers are always concerned with making sure that we're meeting all the requirements of state law, make sure that we receive full funding, and there's no issue there. So House Bill 164 specifically addresses that as well.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of the concern in the spring was, how are we operating? Are we operating consistent with law? And we often heard, understand that there would be lots of leniency given and understanding as we work through what was called a unique time. 164 with the concept of remote learning really does specifically say, and Sam said this, and this is the great thing about 164, is that if you implement a plan, you will be considered to have met and complied with the minimum hour requirement, and then any requirements to receive state funds. So again, like Sam said, there's the early present for treasurers, again, making sure you have that, and maybe one of the real clear benefits of having a remote plan in place, because it expressly states that in 164.
Now, the requirements of the remote learning plan are set forth in the statute, but the tricky thing about that is if you go to the Ohio Revised Code, or if you're trying to search for some more traditional methods under Ohio law to figure out what those requirements are, you may have a hard time finding it. And the reason for that is that the requirements are part of what's called uncodified law. So it exists within the text of House Bill 164, but you're not going to find it in the Ohio Revised Code if you look for it. And as yet, as far as I know, Brian, they're not in the Ohio Administrative Code.
Yeah, and
So,
we're not expecting anything in the administrative code. There's nothing that requires a state board to take action. So this is really just, again, it'll be uncodified law. Depending on if you're someone who enjoys searching through the Legislative Service Commission's website or the state website for looking at legislation, and you're not used to that, it could be hard to find. But again, you just can't type in a code section like 3313.64 and find it. You have to do a little bit more digging to get there.
but one of the things that we've been working on internally is a template that addresses all of the plan requirements. So when you start to work on this plan for your district, or if you're thinking about wanting to pursue a remote learning plan for the fall, the requirements that are contained in House Bill 164 are up on your screen now. And it's just 6 requirements. It's not overly complicated, at least in theory. And the requirements themselves, just in brief terms, we can go through quickly. The first is a description of how the student's instructional needs are going to be determined and documented. Basically, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it?
And then the second one, the method to be used for determining competency, granting credit, and promoting students to a higher grade level. As we were talking before about blended learning, remember it was competency based. Here, the method is left open to local control, so you can determine the method for determining competency, for granting credit, and promoting students. So there is no specific requirement that it's based on competency, which it is in blended, and that, again, promotion, which under the, or the issuing of credit, which for blended learning was not allowed to be based on a minimum number of days or hours. Here, there's, again, more flexibility at the local level.
Number 3, the requirement of the school's attendance requirements. So everybody sort of, I would say, got a bit of a pass in the spring with the pandemic. ODE issued a couple different iterations of guidance saying that sort of you're going to be deemed to have complied with attendance, or students will be deemed to be in attendance. It doesn't look like that's going to be the default rule for remote learning. Instead, you have to specify what your attendance requirements are, but this is one of those places where you want to be specific enough to make it clear that you've met the requirements of the plan, but you don't really want to box yourself in and say these are the only ways that you're going to be able to do that. And there's kind of an art to that.
Yeah, and I think, again, at a local level, perhaps you experimented with different ways of monitoring attendance in the spring. Even the use of the term document participation and learning opportunities, that may not be something that's familiar to most school districts, not a commonly used term, but it is in other parts of the revised code. So thinking about, again, the difference between maybe participation and learning opportunities versus attendance. I know some school districts were saying that they may be looking at ways of tracking hours on an online program. I can tell you that some have experienced a lot of difficulty with that. So um, things to keep in mind that this is a plan that you'll have for the whole year. It will be submitted to the Department of Education. So you want to make sure that you're setting up a plan that you can actually implement depending on the number of different scenarios that may be presented. And again, we're drafting this in the summer without the benefit of knowing what the school year will be like. If there's one thing we learned from this past year, it's that things can change and change pretty quickly.
Number four, you have to include a statement of how student progress is going to be monitored. So how are you ensuring that they're meeting the benchmarks that they need to be meeting? If, for example, you're not in a traditional setting, you don't have that sort of face-to-face interaction where you can keep an eye on those things a little more closely.
Number five, a description as to how equitable access to quality instruction will be ensured. Again, comparing this to blended learning, remember that blended learning requires students to have access to digital learning tools. Here, we're talking about equitable access to quality instruction. So no requirement for there to be access to computers, but making sure that all students who are learning remotely will have the ability to access instruction. So whether that, again, almost that same flexibility that we would see in a Blizzard bag where it can be online or it can be in a more of a paper pencil method, you have options, but those are to be described in your plan.
And the last requirement, number six, a description of the professional development activities that will be offered to teachers. Of course, you want to keep your teaching staff involved in this discussion. You probably have all your staff involved in the discussion for how you're going to operate in this coming school year. But the plan specifically is required to address how you're going to keep your teachers at a place where they feel competent and confident in implementing the plan that you've suggested through your remote learning documents. So this is where we're going to break probably every PowerPoint presentation rule by showing you just starkly the difference between, on the left-hand side, the blended learning requirements. And Brian, you've pointed out that it's when you compare it one side by side, you'll really see one, it seems, at least at face value, is much more complicated than the other. So here's blended learning, here's remote learning under 164.
Yeah, and you can see again, and we know in talking to a lot of districts that have been working on their policy and their procedures for blended learning, they were going through and asking a lot of those questions. And again, we talked about this briefly before, but we were having conversations about, on the left there, blended learning, what is a teacher of record and the licensure requirements for the teacher of record. Again, having access to the digital learning tools, number five. And there's all these questions and issues with how you'll be developing your program and through your policy and procedures. But then you look over at remote learning, and it's significant to think about the things that are not included, and again, the much more flexibility that you would have.
And when you have these things up side by side, you can see that there is a bit of overlap between these concepts, but they really are very different things. So this is where it becomes really important to have a realistic evaluation of what's going to be good for your district and working through with your council how to create plans that comply with one or the other statute, depending on what it is that you're trying to pursue.
Sam, we've talked about this, that the governor indicated that there will be guidance that will be forthcoming on perhaps what the start of the school year will be like. We don't know how much of that will be related to House Bill 164 and the concept of remote learning. But again, as it's written, it really is to focus on giving school districts a lot of local control in developing their plan. And I would say sometimes it's even significant for what 164 and remote learning does not address. And that's different scenarios. That is, does your school district have to be entirely closed to implement a remote learning plan? Can students choose to not come in if they're concerned about contracting COVID-19? We're all aware of those surveys that went out asking parents about their feelings about having children come back, or is there some different option? So again, maybe there's some gray area that still remains to be seen about how broad your remote learning plan could be applied and implemented. But as of right now, I think the understanding is that you do have that flexibility.
Right. So we'll keep an eye out for any guidance that comes out. But as you said, the theme, at least, that seems to be consistent among lawmakers that I've seen interviewed in various news articles, from the press conferences that we've had recently in the last few weeks, is this idea that this is going to be a local decision. So we've put up on the screen the important differences between the three plans or the three types of learning that we've focused on today: your Blizzard bag programs, your blended learning, and your remote learning. And we put just sort of high level reference points for you that will be a good starting point just to see at first glance the important deadlines that are different, some of the documentation that differs between the three. And I think for me, one of the things that's really interesting about House Bill 164, if you look towards the bottom of this chart, is the category publication on ODE's website. So when you implement a Blizzard bag plan, or if you decide that you want to pursue blended learning, ODE is not going to publish your plan on its website. But one of the things specific in House Bill 164 is that remote learning plans are going to be publicly available and published on the website. So whether it's as a resource to other districts who are looking for inspiration, or whether it's for transparency so that each school district can see what it is their school is doing, that's something also to keep in mind when you're putting these plans in place, is that they're going to be very visible.
But the one thing I will say is, and it's stated in 164, is that an adopted plan shall not be subject to approval by the department. So although it's going to be submitted to the department does not have the authority to approve. And again, some of this language, a lot of this was introduced, actually the concept of remote learning, when we heard first that there was more legislation coming forward. And there was Senate Bill 319, which was believed to be the second COVID-19 legislation for school districts. That remote learning wasn't in that. And then when that legislation migrated over to 164, it happened very quickly, and that's where the concept of remote learning came forward. So really no discussion in advance, publicly at least, about what remote learning would include. But again, it's, I think, significant to see that an adopted plan shall not be subject to approval by the department.
Right. But one of the things that you are going to want to keep in mind, and well, several things that you'll want to keep in mind, other things to consider when, whether it's going to be blended learning or whether it's going to be remote learning, there obviously are special considerations that you'll need in terms of providing special education services to students. You'll want to keep the requirements of your collective bargaining agreement in mind, or if you're currently in the midst of negotiations, you'll probably want to start having the conversation about what it's going to look like and what requirements are going to be depending on the plan that you're starting to formulate for the next school year.
And then the last one, again, guidance from ODE to the extent that we are told that may be coming. Just remember, though, that the deadline for a board to adopt a plan for remote learning is July 31st, and to submit that plan by July 31st.
And
so we're at a tight time frame.
Yeah, let me go back to that last slide right in the middle. That's where the deadline is that Brian's referring to. So those are really helpful if you want to highlight those or revisit those.
So we know it's been a long year and a number of changes, but this is something, again, that provides really that certainty that we've been looking for, that if we implement something like remote learning, we know that, again, we'll be meeting those hourly requirements and that there will be no issues with funding. So I think there are advantages to adopting a remote learning plan. However, that really does require you to start developing that plan and making sure that your board it'll be ready for the time of your board meeting in July. And again, we know it's been a long year, but it's that next step that you really have to take to get ready for the fall.
House Bill 164 wasn't only about remote learning. It also dealt with a couple of other things that are going to be relevant to you as you do your planning for next year. One of which was teacher grade band flexibility. So the ability to have teachers teach either a certain number of levels above or below what they're certified to teach. The teacher evaluations were slightly altered, at least as far as it relates to student growth measure, I believe. And then House Bill 164 started as a bill about religious expression. So expect that to be another issue of particular focus, but that could be an entirely different webinar.
Third grade reading guarantee, another, again, exceptions are being made, and in terms of the promotion percentage and the requirements to be promoted. As we saw in the spring, a lot of rethinking about whether or not those are required. And then the last one is special education services, which delves into really, more flexibility into how you can deliver certain services. And we know that's been an issue as school districts have been operating remotely in the spring, and it allows those type of services to also be delivered in the fall as well. But again, another area of concern for districts as you try to get those services included even though you've not been able to have your students in the school building.
Thank you for joining us for the webinar. We hope this has been helpful in level setting and getting you thinking about some of the things you'll need to consider for the fall in light of the new legislation and in light of paths you may have already started to undertake. We have more information available at our website, and we'll continue to update our blog as more information becomes available both from the state legislature and from the Ohio Department of Education. Thank you for joining us.